I studied economics in college when I was young, and I learned there about a man named Ibn Khaldun, who lived 1,200 years ago in Egypt. And 1,200 years ago, he said, in the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, the tax rates were low, but the revenue was great. He said in the end of the empire, when the empire was collapsing, the rates were great and the revenue was low.
We're about to unravel a pretty incredible story about one of the most famous economic ideas of the 20th century, and how its real roots are hidden, like 7 centuries in the past. Seriously, it's a story about a curve, a brilliant scholar, and a forgotten history that kind of changes how you see things. So our story doesn't start in some dusty old library. Nope. It begins right in the heart of modern politics. It all starts with a simple sketch on a napkin that will go on to shape decades of economic policy. Picture this. It's 1974, a restaurant in Washington, D.C. An economist named Arthur Laffer is having a meeting with a couple of senior White House officials. And to explain this really powerful idea he has, he just grabs a napkin, picks up a pen, and sketches out a simple, hump-shaped curve. And that little sketch? Well, it became the legendary Laffer Curve. Now, the logic, which was treated as this huge revelation at the time, is actually elegantly simple. Think about it. Tax something at 0%, you get zero revenue. Obvious, right? But tax it at 100%, and you also get zero revenue because, hey, who's going to work for nothing? The curve argues that somewhere in between, there's a sweet spot for tax rates. And if you go past it, the government actually starts to lose money. But here's the thing about big ideas, right? They almost never just appear out of thin air. They're usually rediscoveries or maybe new ways of framing really old insights. Which kind of makes you wonder, was this revolutionary concept from the 70s really all that new? And that's the central question we're diving into. Was this sketch on a napkin a true modern breakthrough? Or was it just an echo of a conversation that someone started centuries and centuries earlier? Okay, so this is where our story takes a really fascinating turn. We've got to leave 1970s Washington behind and travel back in time, and I mean way back, to find the real source of this whole idea. So on one end of the timeline, you've got Laffer's napkin in 1974, and on the other, the publication of a massive, monumental work of history and sociology all the way back in 1377. We're talking about a gap of 597 years. Just let that sink in. And here's the absolute kicker. Laffer never even claimed he invented the concept. He was really open about it. He said the idea came from a 14th-century North African scholar and historian named Ibn Khaldun. But what Ibn Khaldun wrote about in his masterpiece, the Muqaddimah, was so much bigger, so much deeper. You see, Laffer's curve was about how to get the most tax revenue. Ibn Khaldun's insight was about the very life and death of entire civilizations. For him, high taxes weren't just bad for the budget. They were a symptom that the state itself was in decline. Because for Ibn Khaldun, this whole tax principle wasn't some clever trick for balancing the books. It was just one single piece of a much, much grander theory. A theory about the cycles of how civilizations rise and, eventually, fall. He saw history as this predictable cycle. It all starts with a new dynasty. They're lean, effective, and they keep taxes low. This sparks commerce, wealth grows, it's all good. But then, success breeds complacency. The state gets bigger, the bureaucracy gets bloated, and to feed this growing machine, taxes have to go up. And that's the turning point. The higher taxes start to choke the very economic activity that built all the wealth in the first place. The tax base shrinks, and the state just collapses under its own weight, which, of course, paves the way for a new dynasty to come in and start the whole process over again. And this really gets to his core philosophy. You can't separate the spreadsheet from the society. For him, economic policy was totally inseparable from the moral and social health of a community. A state with unfair, high taxes wasn't just being inefficient. It was, in a way, losing its soul. Now, Ibn Khaldun wasn't just some isolated genius. He was actually the product of a long, sophisticated intellectual tradition during the Islamic Golden Age that had been debating these very ideas for hundreds of years. I mean, just think about this. Way back in the 8th century, the scholar Abu Yusuf was already using cost-benefit analysis for public works projects. By the 11th century, al-Mawardi was warning that public debt should only ever be a last resort. So these core ideas we still debate today, fiscal restraint, defending private property, respecting markets, these were all part of a really sophisticated mainstream conversation. So what this shows us is that ideals like, say, limited taxation, they aren't uniquely modern ideas, and they're certainly not exclusively Western. They're part of a deep, global conversation that's been going on across civilizations for centuries. And this all brings us to the big takeaway. Why does rediscovering all this matter today? Well, it's about a concept called deep referencing, and it's a really powerful tool for how we think about our own challenges. Deep referencing is pretty simple. It just means we stop acting like all our problems are brand new. It's the practice of deliberately connecting our current debates, whether it's about taxes or debt or the role of government, to the huge history of human thought that came before us. And the value here is just immense. I mean, sure, it corrects the historical record, but way more importantly, it broadens our whole range of solutions by showing us that our questions have been asked before. By reconnecting policy to this long arc of human inquiry, it just enriches our own ability to think beyond the immediate crisis and see the much bigger picture. Because what happens without that connection? Well, economic policy, stripped of all that historical depth, just risks becoming a set of, technical adjustments. It becomes a shallow exercise, totally disconnected from justice, from morality, and from those grand cycles that Ibn Khaldun saw so clearly. The story of the Laffer Curve and Ibn Khaldun is such a powerful reminder of this. We are not starting from zero. We are the inheritors of a deep, rich, and global conversation about how to build a prosperous and just society. And that leaves us with a really fascinating and I think urgent question to think about. If an idea this profound was just waiting to be rediscovered, what other solutions, what other brilliant insights are still out there, lying dormant in our shared global history, just waiting for us to listen?